So, I wanted to talk about 1999. The year of 1999 was a pretty pivotal year in recent world history. A number of things happened in 1999. First of all, Russia had been devastated by the fall of the Soviet Union. The economy of Russia had austerity, shock therapy economics, mass unemployment, mass hunger, and the country had been devastated. But 1999 was the year that Vladimir Putin got elected on a platform of fixing the economy with oil and natural gas. 1999 was also the year of the Battle of Seattle. I don't know if folks remember the Battle of Seattle, which was a big anti-globalization protest. The World Trade Organization was gathering in Seattle. Labor unions, community groups, as well as environmental activists and others protested. There was a kind of a riot and a heavy-handed police response. Rubber bullets were shot and tear gas, and it was, an anti-globalization protest that happened in Seattle. In addition to that, Hugo Chavez was elected president of Venezuela. That was the year that, Venezuela had been devastated by the cutbacks and austerity, and there had been a protest movement, the Caracazo, this rebellion that had rocked Caracas against the rising costs of fuel. And in response to that, you had this urban rebellion, the Caracazo. Out of the Caracazo, you got the attempted military coup by Chavez and his allies in the military. Chavez went to prison, got out of prison, and then he ran for office on a platform of improving life in Venezuela and got elected in 1999. 1999 was also a pretty important year in my own life, because in 1999, I went to Ecuador. I was a 12-year-old child, and my dad, who has a job, side job really, leading nature tours in the Galapagos Islands, I went with my dad to Ecuador. And at that point, Ecuador was gripped by a famine, a man-made famine. They'd been forced to accept the US dollar as their currency. They'd been forced to, engage in austerity. There were also some, problems related to the environment. They talked about El Nino or La Nina at the time. In addition to that, the Asian markets crashed. You'll remember the Asian markets crashed at the end of the 1990s. And so there was mass hunger and unemployment and poverty in Ecuador. I was a 12-year-old child, and I saw, as I got off the plane in Quito, Ecuador, the extreme amount of poverty that existed. I was kind of blown away. I came to Quito, Ecuador in the middle of a famine, and I had never seen that level of extreme poverty. I saw whole crowds of desperately poor people all over the city of Quito, Ecuador. And I now know that those were people from the countryside who'd lost their farms and lost their homes and were desperately poor and had piled into the cities. There was just extreme amounts of poverty. 1999 was a pivotal year because 1999, after a decade after the fall of the Soviet Union and the results of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the fall of the Eastern Bloc, starting in about 1999, we started to see the winds of change shift in the world. And with Bolivarianism in Venezuela, with the rise of Russian President Vladimir Putin, we started seeing things shift. And then, you'll remember 9/11, the September 11th attacks. And after 9/11, the country was kind of whipped up into a frenzy of patriotism. Some of us, it's interesting to think, some of us weren't even born yet at that point, but the country was whipped up into a frenzy of very frightening patriotism. It was, my country, right or wrong. George W. Bush said that you're either with us or you're against us. You're either with us or you're with the terrorists. There were flags everywhere and military parades everywhere, and it was quite frightening. And in that moment, the organized political left completely dropped the ball and made what I consider to be one of their greatest blunders, was that if you listen to what Howard Zinn and Noam Chomsky and Ward Churchill said in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks, you would think that Osama bin Laden was Ho Chi Minh. You would think that Osama bin Laden was Che Guevara. The narrative that they had was that America has gone all over the world and committed all these horrendous crimes, true, and that now America has been attacked and some of what America has done to the rest of the world has happened to the United States. Again, true, but it's a problematic narrative because Iraq, that had suffered under horrendous sanctions from the United States, did not attack the United States. China didn't attack the United States. Vietnam did not attack the United States. The people who attack the United States are people that are U.S. allies. Saudi Arabia was aligned with the United States. And immediately after 9/11, you'll notice that the government of Libya, led by Gaddafi, was very happy to support the United States and even offered to torture prisoners to help the United States catch the perpetrators of 9/11. And the Syrian government was also said, wow, we've been fighting al-Qaeda types for years, and the Saudis have been trying to overthrow us for years, and we would like to help you. And Iraq supported the United States, and Cuba supported the United States. And many countries around the world said, my goodness, we've been dealing with these extremists and fanatics that the USA has been backing against the Soviet Union and against independent and nationalist governments around the world. And now these extremists, kind of like the Contras of Nicaragua, kind of like other extremists the USA has backed around the world, now they've turned around and attacked the United States. So maybe for a moment we can get the United States to understand how bad these policies are of arming these extremists. But the interpretation that the U.S. organized political left had is because it was the United States that was attacked, and because the person who did it was a brown-skinned person from another part of the world, they immediately started sympathizing to some degree or other with the perpetrator. The idea was that somehow the Al-Qaeda were freedom fighters or something like that. And Yuri Kochiyama, who's a very important Asian American activist of Japanese heritage, a friend of Malcolm X, she was in her 80s, she was old, and we can forgive her for this, but she gave a horrendous interview where she compared Osama bin Laden to Malcolm X and Ho Chi Minh and said he's a hero to the people of the world, and that wasn't the case. And you can understand why that message to average Americans didn't go over so well, right? And if the country's just been attacked and people are fearing for their lives and there's hysteria about terrorist attacks, if the message of the left is, well, we deserved it, we're the bad guys, we're the terrorists, you can understand that, especially in the age of very simplistic, watered-down politics, where everyone has a very short attention span, the response of people to Noam Chomsky, to Howard Zinn, to Ward Churchill was a hostile one. It was an unfriendly one, because they said, look, we feel like we're under threat, we feel like we're under attack, and the organized political left is telling us basically that we deserve it, and kind of making statements that imply somehow the people who did it are heroes. You can understand why the left was isolated. And when Bush, coming out of 9/11, attacked Afghanistan, he had something like 90% approval ratings for his invasion of Afghanistan, and the organized political left was pretty isolated. Now, the invasion of Iraq was much less popular. Europe opposed it and other forces opposed it. Iraq had nothing to do with the 9/11 attacks, so there was widespread opposition to the war in Iraq. The country at the time of the invasion was about 50-50. But there was a lot of confusion on the left because they had this narrative of we are going to speak truth to power. There was a lot of religious pacifism, a lot of candlelight vigils, and a lot of that settlers mentality that average Americans are the enemy. And Ward Churchill, who was the leading Native American scholar, who became kind of a target of Fox News during these years, Ward Churchill, he wrote his essay, Some People Push Back, where he talked about how he said 9/11 was horrendous, but it logically makes sense because of the U.S. sanctions on Iraq that killed all these innocent people. What would you do if you're an Iraqi? What can you do to wake the Americans up? Well, the thing was, Iraq didn't attack the United States. So, I mean, it's a fallacious essay. And the essay blames average Americans. It says, average Americans know the U.S. government put these sanctions on Iraq. It's killing people. They're not doing anything about it. And it referred to some people in the Twin Towers as little Eichmanns, compared them to, it was a horrendous anti-populist narrative. But it comes out of the 1960s. This is the 1960s political narrative. This is the weather underground that thinks average Americans are pigs. That's how they responded to it. And Ward Churchill, it should be noted, the leading Native American scholar, and he wrote these essays after 9/11 that made him kind of a target for Fox News and the conservatives. But he's also, he was the main one of the main ideologues of Native American support for the Contras in Nicaragua. And he actually went to Nicaragua to work with the Contras against the Sandinistas in the 1980s, published essays justifying Native Americans collaborating with the CIA against the socialist government of Nicaragua. So it kind of makes sense that his analysis of this would be a kind of a wacky and weird one. But it's the anti-war protest movement against the war in Iraq where I first got my political start. And I want to describe the political atmosphere that was going on during those years, because it's now history, right? For some of us, this sounds like, it's a more recent event. Some of us weren't even born yet. So this is now history. But at the time of the anti-war protest movement against the invasion of Iraq, the big anti-war coalition was called United for Peace and Justice. And it was run by members of the Democratic Socialists of America and members of the Communist Party and members of committees of correspondence. The leader of it was a woman named Judith LeBlanc, who is on the national board of the Communist Party. She's of Native American heritage. And they organized big anti-war protests in Washington, D.C., where you had members of Congress, Democrats like Barbara Boxer and others would speak, and they could get really big numbers, hundreds of thousands of people. And they were the main anti-war coalition. It was much more pacifist-oriented, and you never would have known communists were involved. They were at the top, kind of organizing it, but you never would have known they were involved. It looked like a lot of Democrats and pacifists and religious leaders marching against the Iraq War. Then you had the Answer Coalition, which was started by Workers' World Party members, eventually broke away and formed the Party of Socialism and Liberation. And the Answer Coalition, it stood for Act Now, to Stop War and End Racism. And they were kind of one step ahead of United for Peace and Justice. And they were very good at getting the permits, as we talked about in previous classes. Then you had something called Not in Our Name. And Not in Our Name was started by members of the Revolutionary Communist Party. And Not in Our Name, they bought an ad in the New York Times that they got a lot of celebrities, rappers and TV stars and others to sign. Noam Chomsky, Barbara Kingsolver, people like that. They signed this ad, and they had this pledge of resistance they wanted everyone to take, that as people living in the United States, it's our responsibility to oppose the crimes of our government. And they were, I guess, in practice, they were formally part of the United for Peace and Justice Coalition, but it was very much the RCP's thing. And they had, the Earth flag, a flag with the Earth on it. That was their symbol. And they had the Not in Our Name pledge. And it was very much a moralistic appeal, right? It was like, the American government commits these crimes, but not in our name. And that was the Iraq War protest movement. And what was interesting about the Iraq War protest movement was nobody in the ruling class, at least of the United States, supported it. Now in Europe, there, especially Jacques Chirac and others were opposing the attack on Iraq. But in the United States, almost all of the Democratic Party was supporting the war and invasion of Iraq. Joe Biden, Hillary Clinton, all of them were supporting it. And the Democrats, or the Republicans, were all supporting it as well. And the Iraq War protest movement was this kind of isolated section. It was like, here are the people that are completely disconnected from U.S. society. Here are the people that for somehow think America is the main enemy, not Al-Qaeda. And they're fringe and they're extreme. And what I thought was interesting was that, Alex Jones, before he became what he is today, he was just this conspiracy radio host. He was at those anti-war rallies. And he was a right-winger and a libertarian with a John Birch Society background. But he was against the war, and so he was walking around, You had libertarians. The Libertarian Party would go to those demonstrations because they were against the war in Iraq, and they were there. And it was just, the Iraq War protest movement was this kind of, fringe element that no one in the power structure seemed to support. And it was communists who were stage managing it, whether it was the Revolutionary Communist Party or Committees of Correspondence, DSA, CPUSA, or the Answer Coalition and the Marcyites. They were stage managing it, but it was this enclave where dissidents could go, where people that had no influence in the government, no base among the population, the college Noam Chomsky fan club could hang out and do their thing. And occasionally they would show it on C-SPAN. They would show the rallies on C-SPAN. And that was meant to direct to the world. Look, we let these people do their thing. America is an all-inclusive free society. They kind of were there and they didn't do much. And there was a joke because, there were some elements, that are more middle class that wanted to do street confrontations and wanted to occupy buildings and such. And many people were critical of the Answer Coalition because the Answer Coalition was kind of restraining people and very much wanted the rallies to be legal and calm, etc. So that, there came to be a joke among activists in the United States that, the two police officers are talking to one another and they say, oh, there's a group of anti-war protesters who were breaking windows and getting into scuffles and a bunch of them got arrested. And they say, who was it? And the other police officer says, oh, I think it's those guys from the Workers' World Party and the Answer Coalition. And the other one said, no. He said, violence is never the answer. And the understanding was that a lot of these protests, despite the fact there was a lot of radical words being pushed, they were really tame and they didn't really challenge anything because at the same point they were being supported by the power structure. Now in Europe it was different. There were a lot of power structure forces in Europe that were sympathetic to opposing the war, but the U.S. Marxist left that was opposing the war in Iraq had no friends in the circles of power. And that you can really say that the Answer Coalition and United for Peace and Justice and Not in Our Name, that was the last hurrah of the 1960s movement. That was the very end of the 1960s New Left. The Soviet Union was done, but the political forces that had aligned with the Soviet Union or had Marxism, Leninism as their orientation, that was kind of the last time that they were stage managing protests all by themselves. And it was very much, if you went to those demonstrations, it had a leftist or Marxist character to most of what was being said. And while they were not very effective, and while they were largely very isolated, it was very much communist-dominated and communist-led, despite the differences that existed between the different groups. But, you know, towards the end of Bush's presidency, U.S. imperialism was once again in a crisis. As I said, the winds of the world started changing in 1999. You know, 2006, well, first of all, let me back up. The U.S. invasion of Iraq had one very dramatic result that often gets underestimated, which is that oil prices went through the roof. And I remember this. Gas prices were through the roof, and oil prices were the highest they'd ever been in history. At one point, they were almost $120 a barrel. Now, we're way past that now, I believe, but it was at that point the highest oil prices in the history of the world. And we were seeing dramatic shifts in the global economy. And the economy of Russia, Putin had restructured it to be centered around oil and natural gas. Meanwhile, the Islamic Republic of Iran, after their revolution, the economy was largely centered around a nationalized oil and a popular government that had come out of a revolution. And in Venezuela, Hugo Chavez, as he was moving ahead, was also restructuring the economy of Venezuela, centered around the state Bolivarian socialism with oil money. So George W. Bush, by invading Iraq, he shot oil prices through the roof. And on the one hand, that made his friends at ExxonMobil and BP and Shell and Chevron very wealthy. On the other hand, it made the new Russian state also much more profitable and lucrative, and it brought a lot of money into the Russian government as it was pushing back against neoliberalism. And it put a lot of money into the hands of the Venezuelan state as well. And in Iran, you saw the hardliners. What was quite interesting is that at the time of 9/11, Iran was very much drifting towards the United States because Iraq was Iran's enemy. And so Iran was getting friendlier and friendlier to the United States. However, in George W. Bush's State of the Union speech after 9/11, he talked about the axis of evil. And he named Iraq, Iran, and North Korea. Three countries that, you know, have very little in common, right? Except they're all anti-imperialist, right? You know, one is a Marxist-Leninist, you know, socialist government on the Korean Peninsula, one's Ba'athist Arab secular socialism, and one is the Islamic Republic of Shia Islam. All three of them were named. And so the fact that Iran, which was reaching out to the United States and saying, let's team up against Iraq because they hated Iraq, was, you know, kind of faced with that, and the oil prices went through the roof, you saw the resurgence of the hardliner elements, the folks who took to heart much more the anti-imperialist and anti-capitalist goals of the Islamic Revolution. You know, they said not capitalism but Islam, which was a message of Khomeini at the time of the revolution, war of poverty against wealth. And so Ahmadinejad became president of Iran, and Ahmadinejad was very much seen as kind of an ally of the more anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist elements in Iran. And then you'll remember that, I believe it was 2006, Israel invaded Lebanon. And in Lebanon, you have an organization called Hezbollah. And Hezbollah are Shia Muslim, anti-imperialist revolutionaries that are aligned with Iran. And Israel was defeated very strongly and driven out of Lebanon by Hezbollah. And all over the world, and I remember this because I was a college student and I went to the pro-Palestine rallies in Washington, D.C. You had crowds of people, which maybe now things have changed a little bit, but the amount of Islamophobia that existed in the USA following 9/11 was very extreme. But yet you had crowds and crowds of thousands of Arab Americans and white Americans all chanting, "Long live Hezbollah, long live Hezbollah," in Washington, D.C. That was huge. And if you think it was big in the United States, in Europe, that was huge. And all over the Arab world, in countries where the folks are Sunni, and all over the Arab world, people were chanting, "Long live Hezbollah." Hezbollah were considered heroes because they delivered such a strong defeat to Israel. And so, because of that, you had George W. Bush, as the President of the United States, was basically seen for having overseen a debacle. Imperialism was suddenly in crisis. You know, the Venezuelan and the Bolivarian opposition had spread to Bolivia, Nicaragua. You had the Sandinistas back in power, and they were losing control of Latin America. Meanwhile, Russia was getting stronger. The Iranians were much more anti-imperialist, and the hardliner camp in Iran was stronger. And U.S. imperialism was in a crisis. And Bush had alienated Europe. The French government and the Iraqi government had a very strong financial relationship. And at the time that Bush had wanted to launch his invasion of Iraq, the French had gotten up, and Jacques Chirac, who's definitely a murdering imperialist and opponent of people around the world that want independence, Jacques Chirac had given speeches condemning Bush as a warmonger, and it seemed very clear the French government had opposed it. You'll remember in 2004, when Bush was running for re-election, Michael Moore made the film Fahrenheit 9/11. It was just a hit piece on George W. Bush. And for this film, that honestly, I mean, I agree with it, but it's not that good of a film. It's just kind of, he just throws everything he's got at Bush. That film won the Palme d'Or at the Cannes Film Festival. And it got like a standing ovation that lasted like 6 hours or something like that. And Europe was furious with Bush and the neocons. And Europe was very much feeling like the United States was not running the world the way it should. And so the tide had started turning. And then this all culminated in 2007, 2008. You had the great financial crash. The housing bubble burst. The U.S. economy crashed. And so many countries around the world are invested in the United States. They all felt the consequences. So in the middle of this atmosphere, you had things changing in left-wing circles all of a sudden. And I saw it, but I didn't put two and two together. There was a case as Obama was first running for president called the Gina 6. And it was a small town in Louisiana where there had been some kind of racial incident. There had been a group of white kids and black kids had gotten into a fight, and the white kids all got detention, and the black kids all got arrested, and it was clearly a case of racial injustice. It was unfair. And it was in a little tiny town, but with this new invention called Facebook, and this new invention called Twitter, all of a sudden everyone was talking about the Gina 6. And it wasn't a case of like the protest movement to free Mumia Abu-Jamal, where the left had been organizing around it. And it wasn't an issue of, people in community organizations. It was very clear that somebody at the top had said, we're going to make this an issue. And you also have to keep in mind that in 2005, before 2006, there had been the horrendous incident in Louisiana with Hurricane Katrina. Hurricane Katrina had happened, and thousands of black folks were left on their rooftops to die. And there was a feeling in the black community that, I think Kanye West on national television, he said, George Bush doesn't care about black people. And there was a feeling in the black community that Bush was their enemy. And there was also a feeling that some kind of rebellion might be happening. And there started to be some urban riots, etc. So out of all of this, you started to see cases get highlighted where you had Obama as the presidential candidate. You had cases like the Gina 6 getting highlighted. And this was the first time we were starting to see protest movements that weren't coming from the movement. They were coming from above. Right? Somebody from above was saying, okay, we're going to start highlighting cases and we're going to start building something. And this wasn't the movement. This wasn't United for Peace and Justice. This wasn't the communist groups. This was coming from above. And as it got to the point that Barack Obama was elected president, things were very, very different. Now, after Obama won the presidency, there was something called the Tea Party movement. Folks remember the Tea Party movement. And one of the things that many people noticed about the Tea Party movement was that there seemed to be two Tea Parties. There was the Tea Party on television and the Tea Party that actually happened. And if you went to these Tea Party rallies, it was a lot of working class white people who were saying things like, we want jobs, and why is our government spending money on wars? It tended to be supportive of Ron Paul, it tended to be non-interventionist, and it tended to blame the big banks. However, the Tea Party on Fox News blamed communism for all the problems, was supporting Israel and calling Obama a Muslim, and that there was the made-for-TV Tea Party that was neoconservative and was just, supporting Bush and opposing Democrats. And then there was the actual Tea Party, which was average working-class people, most of whom were white and from conservative backgrounds, who were angry at the establishment. It was kind of a continuation of the Ron Paul phenomenon when they were angry at the establishment and they saw, the Obama presidency and the tax code as something that they could target. And it was very interesting to see how media framed the Tea Party, but the Tea Party itself was quite different. What the actual people at those Tea Party rallies wanted and what they cared about was very different than what Fox News claimed that they wanted and what they were about. And then a couple years later, you saw the same thing with Occupy Wall Street. I was a big part of Occupy Wall Street. I was arrested at Occupy Wall Street demonstrations. And there was a made-for-TV Occupy Wall Street, and there was the actual Occupy Wall Street. And the made-for-TV Occupy Wall Street said, we want to take money out of politics and overturn Citizens United. One person, one vote. The Republicans take corporate money, and that's not good. And the actual Occupy Wall Street was saying we need a revolution against capitalism, and the big banks and corporations have all the power, and anarchism and socialism and Marxism and all these different ideas. But it's pretty clear Occupy Wall Street was organized from above, right? I remember how Occupy Wall Street started. Before Occupy Wall Street, I was part of something called Bloombergville. And Bloombergville was a New York City protest movement against the budget in New York City. There were budget cuts going on. Bloomberg closed a number of fire departments and libraries. And the communist groups, we did our thing, and it was small. It was the Workers' World Party, the ISO, a couple different groups. We occupied a street corner to protest Bloomberg's budget. No media coverage whatsoever except for the last day when Democracy Now! Came and filmed it. And that was it. Got almost no coverage. It was small, and it was quite rowdy. On the last day of it, you can watch some video. I think Keaton's dug up some video from the last day of Bloombergville. It got pretty rowdy towards the end. Let's just say there was some arrests and some property destruction. But if you were in New York City, and especially if you were outside of New York City, you would have no idea what was going on. But a couple weeks later, the call went out from Adbusters magazine for occupying Wall Street. And immediately, the New York Times and a whole bunch of publications just decided to run an article. Did you know there's been a call to occupy Wall Street? There's been a call. And then Mayor Bloomberg was giving a press conference, and a reporter asked him, I understand there are people planning to occupy Wall Street. Will you respect their First Amendment rights? And he replied, well, yes, as long as people are following the law. We believe in free speech here in New York City. And they were hyping it months before it ever happened. It was immediately getting hype. And you'll recall a few months before Occupy Wall Street, there was this abominable event in Washington, D.C. they called the Rally to Restore Sanity. And it was Stephen Colbert and Jon Stewart. And they had this rally equating the far left with the far right. And it was supposed to be against the Tea Party or something like that. And it was called the Rally to Restore Sanity. And it was a complete flop. And it didn't have any traction. So after the Rally to Restore Sanity flopped, then it seemed that forces in the establishment that were afraid of the Tea Party went ahead with Occupy Wall Street. And I was there on the first day of Occupy Wall Street, and I remember how things went on, and it was very clear that from above there was a feeling that we needed something in the streets to counter the Tea Party. Nancy Pelosi said she supported Occupy Wall Street. Barack Obama dedicated the monument to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. that he built, and in his speech he said, if Dr. Martin Luther King were alive today, he'd probably be at Occupy Wall Street. And people cried and they felt so moved by it, and it was very clear that Occupy Wall Street was being somewhat controlled. And we used to talk about, those of us who were in the park, etc., we used to talk about the beautiful occupiers, the people that were clearly being paid to be there. They were being paid to be there. Some of them slept in luxury hotels in the Wall Street area and would go to the park every day. And they were the ones that got the interviews on MSNBC. And they were collecting a check. And they were there. And it was very much, they were the ones that stage managed things. And they made very, very sure that no demands were ever raised. And they would make ridiculously insane arguments about why no demands could ever be raised. At one point, we were trying in the Workers' World Party to push them to demand jobs for all. And their response to us is they said, well, then all the government has to do to stop our movement is give everyone a job. And I remember saying to these people, I said, the government's not just going to give everyone a job. And if the government did give everyone a job, and it was a result of the protest, you know how many people would then go out and protest and be inspired by it? You know, so I'm not getting your point here. And they said, no, we don't want jobs, everyone. We want a revolution. And they had this democracy process that was a complete joke. Everything was supposed to be by consensus. And if you liked something, you twinkle-fingered. And if you didn't like something, you down-twinkled it. And it was completely ridiculous. And it was one of the most silly things. But it was interesting because it was a lot of people, their first place to be political, their first place to think about politics, but it was very carefully controlled to make sure that it didn't do anything that really threatened the status quo, and it was being supported by mainstream media, by the top of the Democratic Party, by some of the most powerful forces. And what was also interesting about Occupy Wall Street was that Occupy Wall Street had its, climax, you could say. That there was one night where Mayor Bloomberg announced, tonight we will be clearing the park at Occupy... Oh, no, that's not Bloomberg. Tonight we will be clearing the park at Occupy Wall Street, and we are going to remove them from there. They've been there too long, and it's going to go away now. We're done. So Mayor Bloomberg said that, and after he said that, the American Federation of Labor, the AFL-CIO, and the Democratic National Committee, and all kinds of every liberal group you ever heard of, sent a mass email out to everyone, go and protect Occupy Wall Street. And so I went there that night, and by 6 in the morning, there were thousands and thousands of people surrounded. And of course, they were never going to raid the park. The whole thing was completely staged. And after that, they said triumphant, see, we protected Occupy Wall Street. They didn't raid the park, and everyone felt so heroic about it. And then, at that point, all the beautiful occupiers started disappearing. And they started disappearing and moving on. But a lot of the younger folks and a lot of the crust punks and a lot of the other folks from around the country were still sticking around. They're like, hey, I'm not going anywhere. And that's when, a month later, as it started to fade away, that's when the police raided the park and ultimately cleared Occupy Wall Street. And it's very interesting how it was done. And that was the Occupy Wall Street movement. And one thing that I think is worth talking about is the U.S. intervention in Libya. Now, I was a member of the Workers' World Party at the time, and in Workers' World Party, we opposed the bombing of Libya. We supported Gaddafi as a leader of an independent country. We opposed U.S. intervention. Most of the beautiful occupiers that ran Occupy Wall Street supported the bombing of Libya. They felt that Gaddafi was a dictator. They felt that the people of Libya were fighting for their freedom. But your average rank-and-file Occupy Wall Street activist didn't feel that way. In fact, there were a lot of Occupy Wall Street folks who were more into the libertarian or Alex Jones or those kind of perspectives, and they felt like Gaddafi was being targeted because he pushed an independent currency. But it was really interesting to see that, and especially the folks that were in more Marxist groups, Trotskyite groups, etc., they were supporting that. I was in the Occupy Wall Street camp in the park when Gaddafi was killed, and I noticed that gap. If someone was selling a socialist newspaper, they supported it. And if somebody was just an average person from Ohio or Pennsylvania who'd come up there on a Greyhound bus and was mad about the financial crisis and student debt, they opposed it. And there seemed to be a gap. It was very interesting. And you could say the same thing happened at the Tea Party. But what was also interesting was at the time, I was a member of the Workers' World Party. We opposed the bombing of Libya. But even within our own group, there was this reluctance to support Gaddafi. There was this feeling that we need to distance ourselves from Gaddafi. You know, that Gaddafi's a bourgeois nationalist. It's not real socialism. He's not a true Marxist. And that if we sound like we support Gaddafi too much, we're going to alienate the beautiful movement called the Arab Spring, where all these people are in the streets and they all hate Gaddafi. And there was just this desire to distance ourselves from it. And I was in the Workers' World Party at the time, and I read the Green Book by Gaddafi. And I looked at the economics of Libya, where the state controlled the banks, factories, and industries, and they had a planned economy. It was much more of a planned economy than China is. And I said, this is a socialist country. And nobody in the Workers' World Party could argue with me and convince me it wasn't. Their argument was simply, it's not because we say it's not. It's not because years ago Sam Marcy said it's not. It's not because Fidel doesn't use the term Marxism-Leninism ever. He says Islamic socialism. And I said, well, I thought our understanding was materialism. It's not what you say, it's what you do. And I asked them, show me the difference between the Cuban economy and the Libyan economy. They couldn't do it. Show me the difference between the Chinese economy and the Libyan economy. If anything, Libya is closer to a socialist state-run economy from the 20th century. So it just didn't add up. And it's this kind of lack of ideology and inability to engage with things that kind of led to a situation where a lot of these Marxist groups, as the woke stuff was being fomented from above, they really didn't know what to do but get caught up in it. They didn't know their own ideology. They didn't really have an understanding of what had happened and why the Soviet Union had fallen. And because of that, they didn't know their own ideology. So ideology was coming from above to serve the purposes of the ruling class. And they said, okay, this works for us, right? We're against racism. They're against racism. We're for freedom for women. They're for freedom for women. And as the woke stuff was coming from above, that is so contrary to the class line that we talked about earlier, the working class socialist perspective against racism. They didn't really know how to counter it. And this happened in every socialist group. And I like to joke about, if you hear me clap once, if you hear me clap twice, if you hear me clap 3 times, all right, now we're all going to sit in a circle and we're going to talk about our favorite pizza. And every socialist group started to get taken over by people that talk that way. No matter what, Trotskyites, Maoists, or whatever, you'd inevitably get at a woke shop where you're sitting around and talking about your feelings and talking about who's the most oppressed, and privilege politics came to dominate left-wing spaces. And there was no pushback against it. There was no understanding that this is not us. There was a feeling, well, these people are in the streets, they're doing it, they're the movement, and so it must be good. And it wasn't good. Now, that led me to, during the Occupy Wall Street protest movement, I started doing interviews representing the International Action Center. I worked for Ramsey Clark, who was working closely with the Workers' World Party. I worked for Ramsey Clark at the IAC. I started appearing on Press TV, the TV network from Iran, RT, the TV network from Russia. I started appearing on those networks, and I started giving commentary. And they appreciated the fact that I was anti-imperialist, and unlike most of the voices representing Occupy Wall Street, I was willing to give an anti-imperialist line. And so I got invited in 2013 to attend the World Festival of Youth and Students in Quito, Ecuador. That was a life-changing experience for me. I want to talk about that festival briefly. You know, this is a world communist gathering. After the Second World War, you know, the Soviet Union launched their own response to the World's Fair and some of the gatherings that the USA has to sell itself around the world. And they organized these festivals of communists. After the fall of the Soviet Union, they'd stopped doing it for a while, but then I think like the late 90s, Cuba had one, and they started doing them every 4 years. And I will never forget getting off the plane in Ecuador, right? Because you don't need a visa to go to Ecuador if you're from the United States anyway, but you didn't need no one needed a visa to get into Ecuador as long as you were an invited guest of the festival. And they had all the folks who were there for the festival, the customs from Ecuador, took us to one wing of the airport, like a special wing of the airport. And it was kind of neat. So we're sitting in this wing of the airport, and there's people with T-shirts on. Greek communists are over here. Communists from Albania are over here. Communists from Angola and Zimbabwe are over here. We're all in the airport. We're all wearing our T-shirts. We're trading newspapers. And we're all kind of hanging out until the buses that are going to take us to the festival get there. And it's hundreds of people in this wing of the airport. And I will never forget the moment when they announced, people are whispering, that the plane from North Korea had arrived. The plane from North Korea had arrived, and the airport suddenly got silent, and people were whispering and they weren't talking. And then the door opened. And the plane from North Korea had landed, the door opened, and North Korean communists, dressed in, the men were wearing suits and ties like this, and the women were wearing traditional Korean gowns. They marched in like perfect formation. And the whole airport was silent until one person started applauding. And then more and more people started applauding. And pretty soon, this whole airport was standing and cheering for North Korea. And it was a beautiful moment that I will never forget in my life. I will never forget it. And I thought, I am in the right place. This is where I belong. These are my people. It was amazing. It was an amazing experience. You think about all the Koreans that have been killed by the U.S. imperialists over the years. And then when we sat down with the Kim Il-sung Youth Organization, and they called us our comrades, and they said, we want to make clear to you that we have obviously no love for the fascist government of the United States, but we deeply love the American people, and we hope that you will align with us to defeat the bankers and imperialists that run your country. It was a moving moment. It was a moving moment that I will never forget. And I met with so many different communist groups. We sat down, we had bilateral meetings, and I sat down with these communist groups, and I spoke with them. And all of them said the exact same thing to me, more or less, in different words, different languages, different phrases. What's wrong with American communists? What the hell is wrong with American communists? They said, you guys, we don't get it, you know? We don't get it. They said, you've never built a base among the population. You're small and isolated, and you don't sound like we do. You don't dress like we do. You don't talk like we do. You're a completely different thing. What is wrong with you guys? I remember there was a meeting where it was the Communist Party and the Workers' World Party and the Socialist Workers' Party. We sat down with the Cuban Young Communist League. And this guy from the Young Communist League of Cuba was sitting there, and people were getting up, and the Communist Party was bragging about how they're working with the Democrats to re-elect Obama because the Republicans are fascists, and the Socialist Workers' Party was bragging that they were, selling lots of newspapers of the militant and all of that, and our group, we were bragging about some of our protests, and this Cuban communist got up and he said, I don't want to hear this. I'm tired of this crap. We've been hearing this crap from you Americans for years, and you never build a base among the population. You never expand. Your groups are getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and we're here struggling, and we've been hearing the same song and dance from you guys for years. You guys need to change your tactics. The economy in the USA is crashing. People are losing their homes and jobs. This is when communists are supposed to step up and lead. Why aren't you guys doing it? And I asked that question in my mind. I said, yeah, why aren't we doing it? And it was quite an interesting festival. And I came back from the World Festival of Youth and Students with these questions ringing in my mind. And then, a year later, I got invited to the Islamic Republic of Iran. And I was working with Press TV at that point, and I got an invitation to the New Horizon Conference in Iran, which was an anti-imperialist conference that was held in Iran. And when I got to the New Horizon Conference, they have people there that greet you, that want to know who you are. they asked me, so you're from Brooklyn? And I said, well, I'm originally from Ohio. And there was, wait, what? You're from Ohio? They assumed, because I was from Brooklyn, because I'm a communist, because I have curly hair and some other things, they assumed that I was from a family that had been doing communism for generations, right? And I was one of these peace activists, that my parents had been in SDS, that my grandparents had been in the Communist Party, and that I was part of the left thing. When they found out that I was from Ohio, and that I was from a small town in Ohio, almost everyone I grew up around were Republicans, that I'd been raised in a Christian environment, they were shocked. And they said to me, you know, Caleb, you don't know how important it is that the Islamic Republic of Iran can have an ally like you, somebody who would be with us. Because, you know, Minister Farrakhan comes here every year. We have a lot of black people that are sympathetic to us. We've been talking to the peace activists for years. But it's people like you from small towns in Ohio that are evangelical Christians and Republicans that want to kill all Muslims, that think all Muslims are terrorists, that blindly support Israel. And I remember there was an Iranian film director who recently passed away. And he made a special point of spending so much time with me in Iran and talking to me about who I am and the role that I can play. And he said to me, you know, he remembered he'd lived in the United States during the Vietnam War era. And he talked to me about how young guys from Kansas and Idaho, when they started protesting the Vietnam War, when they started burning their draft cards, when it wasn't just the hippies in New York, when it was widespread among the population, that's when things really started to change. And we talked about it, and we had some amazing conversations. And they kept saying to me, the time, you know, I'd just cut my hair, I'd had these long hair and a beard, and they were more or less saying to me, they didn't use these words, they said, stop being something you're not. Stop trying to pretend to be someone that you're not. Start thinking about where you came from. Start thinking about your country. And honestly, you know, and this is pretty ironic, but, you know, in Iran, they always show us the pictures of Iranians burning the American flag and saying death to America. But the reason that I'm a patriotic socialist today is because of the Islamic Republic of Iran and because of Ayatollah Khamenei. That is a fact. They did it. And I was a member of the Workers' World Party, but as I was starting to question their tactics and their policies, my relationship with them went sour. As the Black Lives Matter movement got going, they were basically, you know, trying to stage manage the Black Lives Matter movement, which they would never be allowed to do because there are much more powerful forces that were supporting it. And it got to the point that I'll never forget the day I was in a meeting, and I was doing my work with Press TV, I was writing my own articles, that they had me come to a meeting. They insisted, you have to come to this internal party meeting. So I sat in this internal party meeting with other people, and they were talking about how the Black Lives Matter protest group that they were organizing, the People's Power Assembly, they were having 80, 90 people come to their office every week for meetings, and they weren't recruiting any of them. And they were just so upset about this. Why is it that we're having meetings around organizing Black Lives Matter protests every week, and we have 80, 90 people come, and they all know about the party. They've looked us up on Wikipedia. They've read all about us, but none of them want to join. What's going on? At that point, I couldn't hold back anymore. And I said, they don't want to join because they don't agree with you. That's why they don't want to join. I'm sorry, but you don't join a group that aligns with North Korea and wants to establish a socialist economy because you think protesting is cool and hip and you went to a rally because you saw it on Facebook. You don't become a communist because that's just not how it works. And this strategy of tailing the movement is only going to lead to, you know, you being further isolated. They didn't want to hear that. They were quite furious about it. And that ultimately was that meeting and that discussion that ultimately led to me going my own way. So my journalism career took off. I started working with RT. But in 2016, I was intimately involved in covering the presidential election in the United States. I was the main U.S. reporter for RT International. And I went to Trump rallies and interviewed Trumpers. I went to Bernie Sanders rallies and interviewed Bernie Sanders people. I went to the very, very small Hillary Clinton rallies and interviewed those folks. And the whole time, I was thinking about things like that letter to the workers of Louisiana. And I was thinking about the fact that this is what is missing. And I met so many Bernie supporters that should be genuine communists. And I met so many Trump supporters that should be genuine communists. But no one was giving this message out. And it was in that atmosphere that eventually I helped with Dakota and some other people. We launched the Students and Youth for a New America clubs, and I guess you could say that the rest is history. That's how we got here today, and that's the origins of our political current, the Center for Political Innovation. But why did we not form a new party? Because when I was out of the Workers' World Party, I was still very vocal on the internet talking about communism. I got endless amounts of messages from 14-year-olds and 15-year-olds. When are you going to start a new party? I want to join your party. Can you start? And I thought about this, and there's a reason I didn't start the Workers' Communist Socialist Revolutionary Labor League, or I didn't scramble the words that it's like the Workers' Party, the Socialist Workers' Party. I didn't do that because none of those groups are serious. And the way Americans think about politics is they think about it in terms of two parties, right? You're a Democrat or a Republican. If you're not a Democrat or a Republican, they're already going, wait, what are you? They're a little bit confused. And on top of that, if you study Lenin and his concept of the Vanguard Party, a Vanguard Party is not 5 or 6 people that think they're the Fourth International. That's not what it is. That a real Vanguard Revolutionary Party is an organization that has a huge amount of people in it, that are all coordinating their activities to serve a common aim. And what they call democratic centralism is a method for making that party coordinate its activities. The idea is we're going to combine all our strength, we're going to march as one. We might debate, but we march as one. But in the United States, we have the opposite. We tend to have a million little tiny isolated groups, and democratic centralism means you're only allowed to have one smart person in a group. Right? And when another smart person joins, they might start questioning or disagreeing with that person, and so then they have to split and form a new group, and they're the great leader of this group. And a lot of this comes from the way the history of the Bolshevik Party was reinterpreted, and the cult of personality built around Lenin, which served real political purposes. I don't think that was wrong, but it kind of distorted the way we think of these concepts of democratic centralism. And in the age of Facebook and Twitter and social media, the idea that you're going to have one voice representing the entire party is not realistic. You need to have an atmosphere where every member of your group can start a YouTube channel, where every member of the group has a Twitter page. And democratic centralism has largely turned into a mechanism of, well, let the party speak for you, and it's not very successful. Maybe eventually something that can call itself a party or a Vanguard Party will emerge. It won't be like what existed in the 20th century. It'll be different. It'll be different for different times. If the situation changes in 24 hours, the tactics must also change in 24 hours. And while we should learn from the past, we learn to apply it to the present, not to blindly copy it and not to LARP. But all of that needs to be put aside at the moment. Because right now, we are trying to build the Center for Political Innovation. We want to achieve 1K by May. And I keep continuing to emphasize that we're not in a race against the Communist Party, and we're not in a race against Jacobin, and we're not in a race against the PSL or Trump or Biden. We are in a race against time. Because right now, the United States is entering a very serious political crisis. And when the storm comes, our YouTube numbers won't matter. The number of dues-paying members we have won't matter. All that will matter is how much infrastructure we have built as an organization. How much real political infrastructure have we constructed? How much of a community of support have we built? How much are we able to effectively pull off? That's all that will matter when the storm comes. And when the storm comes, we need to have 4 things. We need a network of people committed to our mission. We need that network to be a dedicated core of revolutionaries who are capable of swinging into action and dramatically changing what they do in order to meet the needs of the present. We need to have policies and proposals and demands ready that can give voice to the mass demands that would come up in the middle of a crisis. We need to have a group of serious worker politicians who are capable of articulating those demands. And on top of that, we need to have a layer of allies, both domestically and internationally, who can offer us support and sit at the center of a united front against imperialism, as I spoke at the end of my previous presentation. And so, if we're going to be serious about building something that in a moment of crisis could swing into action and change the nature of U.S. politics, we need to start seeing the good in the American people. A lot of evil things in the United States. We talk about the Atlanticist pathology. But I think it's worth noting that as Britain was gearing up to be the global financial empire that it was, as this Atlanticist open international system was emerging, there were many people who didn't like what they saw in Britain or in France or elsewhere as imperialism was emerging, and they came to the United States because they didn't like what they saw. And there were many socialist communities among the early settlers to the United States. You know, Pennsylvania is named after William Penn, who was a Quaker, who didn't want to fight in wars and was a pacifist. You had socialist communities like Zoar and New Harmony and others across the United States. And a lot has been written about Thomas Jefferson and the slaveholders and their role in the American Revolution. But what about Alexander Hamilton and his writings and economic theories expressing belief in human progress, believing that we can get beyond slavery and barbarism and raise people to a higher plane? What about Thomas Paine, the guy who wrote Common Sense, the agitator of the American Revolution, who opposed slavery, who supported the French Revolution and the Haitian Revolution, and advocated a guaranteed minimum income for all citizens? You know, it's funny, around Christmas time, there's a Christmas carol people like to sing, We Three Kings. And it's a Christmas carol. And the chorus of We Three Kings, one of the lines that they use is the chorus, it says, "Westward leading, still proceeding, guide us to the perfect light." And that was first performed in 1857 at the Christmas pageant in New York City. And at the time that was performed, that was a political statement because of Horace Greeley. Horace Greeley was he was the editor of the New York Tribune in the United States. He hired Karl Marx as his London correspondent. And his slogan was, "Go West, young man." And he was a socialist, he was an opponent of slavery, and he popularized the phrase, "Go West, young man," meaning we want to advance, we want to get to a higher plane. He wanted votes for women, he wanted equality. And "Go West, young man" was the slogan that he popularized. And that line that was in this New York City Christmas pageant that made We Three Kings the popular Christmas carol it is today, "Westward leading, still proceeding, guide us to that perfect light," that was an allusion to that. And it was pointing toward the eventual formation of the Lincoln Coalition. Before the American Revolution in the United States, they had what was called the Great Awakening. And it was across the United States, people were realizing that something was wrong in the United States. And you had a lot of pastors, Jonathan Edwards and others, who were going up and down the United States preaching about, get right with God and repent of your sins, etc. And then before the U.S. Civil War, as we were gearing up for the Lincoln Coalition to be formed that eventually led to the Civil War, you had the Second Great Awakening. The Second Great Awakening in the United States. And of course, it expressed itself in terms of religion. But the Second Great Awakening had a huge influence on U.S. culture. I don't know if people are familiar with the American tradition of tent revival pastors. People know about that. They set up the tents. That comes from the Second Great Awakening. If people have ever heard the hymn Amazing Grace, that comes out of the Second Great Awakening. Mormonism, Seventh-day Adventism, and many of the religious groups of the United States come out of the Second Great Awakening. And what was the Second Great Awakening about? It was about redemption, right? Amazing Grace. The story is the guy was a slave trader, and there was a storm, and he feared for his life. And then, after the storm was over, he repented from being a slave trader, and he turned the slave ship around and repented from his sins and turned against slavery. And we know the song John Brown's Body, right? That eventually became the Battle Hymn of the Republic. Yeah, we know about that. But you'll notice that John Brown's Body, originally the tune of John Brown's Body comes from "Hey Brother, Will You Meet Us?" which was a tent revival song. "Hey brother, will you meet us?" Basically saying, will you go to heaven? Will you, hey brother, are you going to join us in heaven? Hey brother, will you meet us on Canaan's salty shores? And if you look at the United States right now, there is a widespread feeling in the culture that it is time to turn around, that something is inherently wrong with the direction that we're moving in. And I think in our own time, in our own way, it's time to get ready for another Great Awakening. Now, obviously, this wouldn't be a religious movement because politics is expressed differently nowadays, right? We're a much more secular society. But at the same time, it's very clear there's a broad feeling among the population that something is inherently wrong. There's a broad feeling that evil is all around us. And there's a broad feeling that we need to challenge the rich and powerful. We need to call them out, and we need to stand for something higher than ourselves. And the moment has come for a kind of spiritual and political awakening that can lay the basis for the fight ahead. And my belief is that the Center for Political Innovation can play a role in carrying out this third Great Awakening, this great socialist awakening of the broad masses of American people as we move toward the revolutionary crisis that is to come. They talk about all this great replacement stuff. There's been a lot of talk about it in result of these mass shootings. And these white supremacists, they make it about race, right? They say that, oh, they're trying to replace the white people. Well, they've been trying to go after the black people for years and years. Look what they did at Hurricane Katrina. Look at mass incarceration. And they're trying to get rid of other communities too. It's not racial. There's no great replacement in terms of race. It's not about trying to get rid of whites and replace them with blacks, or trying to get rid of blacks and replace them with whites. What's going on right now is that they are trying to eliminate all of us because they don't have room for us at the assembly line. Their capitalist system doesn't have room for us. Their capitalist economy is crashing, and we stand outcast and starving amid the wonders that we have made. And so among the broad masses of people, black, white, Asian, Arab, Latino, there is an understanding that they are trying to eliminate us. They have a plan for exterminating us. And also among the broad masses of people who don't have political education and don't have consciousness, there's an understanding that we will not be canceled, and we will fight back, and we will live. So it is our responsibility to tap into this sentiment and point it in the scientific materialist direction that can lead it toward something great. Henry Wallace, the presidential candidate back in 1948, he said, "The march of freedom for the past 150 years has been a long, drawn-out people's revolution. This great revolution of the people, you had the American Revolution of 1775, the French Revolution of 1792, the Latin American revolutions of the Bolivarian era, the German Revolution of 1848, and the Russian Revolution of 1917. Each of these fought for the common man in terms of blood on the battlefield, and some went into excess. But the significant thing is that the people groped their way to the light. More of them learned to think and work together. The people's revolution aims at peace, not at violence. But if the rights of the common man are attacked, it unleashes the ferocity of the she-bear who has lost a cub. When Nazi psychologists tell their master Hitler that we in the United States may be able to produce hundreds of thousands of planes, but we have no will to fight, they are only fooling themselves and him. The truth is that when the rights of the American people are transgressed, as they have been transgressed, the American people will fight with a relentless fury that will drive the Teutonic gods back cowering into their caves. The god of Damarong has come for Odin and his crew. The people are on the march toward an even fuller freedom than the most fortunate people of the world have hitherto enjoyed. The people's revolution is on the march, and the devil and all his angels cannot prevail against it." That's Henry Wallace.
He's our vice president, goddammit.
Yes. The storm is coming. The day will come when everyone realizes it's time to turn the ship around, or we're going to be sailing off of a cliff. And when that moment comes, we must have the apparatus to take the wheel for ourselves and lead the country out of troubled waters. Thank you very much. CPI, 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 CPI,
Dare to struggle!
Dare to win!
Dare to struggle!
Dare to win!
Dare to struggle!
Dare to win!
The camera's right there. Get in the
Come on, get in.
in front of the camera.
To the masses!
To
Out of the movement!
the masses!
Out of the movement!
To the masses!